While the danger of conflict between China and Japan and the threat of North Korea tend to dominate news headlines, East Asia also faces a host of other political, economic, and security challenges. This panel will examine the myriad of challenges that have the potential to escalate into major crises, and what can be done to manage instability in this changing security landscape.
Well, I hope that very stirring video woke everyone up out of their after-lunch digestion. I'm Anthony Nelson of the US-ASEAN Business Council, and as the voiceover told us, we're going to be discussing instability in East Asia. I think it's important to lay out right at the beginning that East Asia right now is more stable than it was for most of the 20th century. That doesn't mean that things are fated to stay that way and that there aren't areas of potential concern and flare-ups there. So we'll be talking about a number of those. You all should be familiar with how the panels work by this point, but I'm going to lay out just a few general points, and then we'll introduce each of our panelists individually for about 5 to 7 minutes of their particular areas of focus, and then we'll refer back to the audience for some of your questions and discussions. We've heard a lot about the U.S.-China relationship, the China-Japan relationship, the North Korea and everybody else relationship, but I want to lay out a couple areas of kind of general sources of instability that at the first can seem to be positive things, but can have negative flip sides. First, economic growth. East Asia is the world's growth engine at this point. The World Bank, I think, puts emerging East Asia's growth for the year at around 8%. But economic growth means more competition for resources. It means energy in particular becomes a limiting factor as the ability to generate power or buy power from somebody else limits the ability of countries to continue to industrialize and continue driving their own growth. Countries that in the past have been suppliers of energy that now are growing may need now to consume more of that energy for their own domestic needs. And our increased ability to get at resources, whether they're those buried under the ocean or trapped in shale gas, means that areas of overlapping claims that have been maybe purely areas of sovereignty concern now have the stakes raised on them because they contain valuable energy resources. So areas that were of conflict before now take on even greater significance. The water resources, both simply for consumption, but also to generate hydropower, are another area of limit. We see people trying to lay out plans for dams along, for example, the Mekong. But in resources that are shared by countries, those plans that one country make need to work with the plans that other countries make, and that can both damage the ability to use the water sources for power generation, but also for food supplies. The economic growth has led to greater budget allocations for defense capabilities. I think we're looking at about a 10% increase in regional defense budgets year on year. Some of that is very natural modernization and countries taking advantage of strong economies to add capabilities that they've needed and to improve fleets that haven't been modernized in a long time. But it does mean that now all of a sudden there's increased presence of vessels in areas where there hasn't before, and countries need to figure out ways to manage increasing interaction and increasing opportunities for encounters. There's also countries deploying capabilities that they haven't had before, where the rules of engagement with a submarine, if a country hasn't ever operated that in their history, creates another opportunity for conflict. We're also seeing increased democratization, or at least an increase in the freedom of speech driven by access to the internet and information across the region. But that in general can be seen as a positive, but it also can lead to a little bit of instability. It means regimes may be less reliable or predictable actors than they have been in the past. We have, for example, an election on the 5th in Malaysia that may see the first change of power there in over 50 years. Even in countries like Singapore, the grip of the PAP is loosening a bit, and the nation's elected officials are having to tack to domestic sentiment a little bit more than they have in the past. A country like Myanmar is in the midst of a historic transition, but that means there's many more opportunities there for conflict. Social media and its increased presence can give a voice to the populace, but it can also be something that's used to fuel and steer conflict based along ethnic lines. That's something we're seeing right now a lot in Myanmar as social media is allowing people to organize and spread and kind of fan the flames of ethnic tensions that when the regime was a little bit more autocratic were kept under a tighter lid. Rising regional nationalist sentiments may lead governments to press international claims with an eye on domestic sentiment, meaning that we see some of these flare-ups over territorial claims where governments are looking first to the populace at home and how they'll respond, and then to the international situation. So we'll consider some of these and a number of key flashpoints as we have our discussion. And if we're feeling particularly creative, we may come up with some policy options to deal with some of those. With that, let me introduce our first panelist. Professor Huang Kyudok is a professor at Sookmyung Women's University. He served as the Deputy Minister for Defense Reform at the Ministry of National Defense here in Korea. He also, I want to note, was served on the ASEAN Regional Forum's Eminent Persons Group. And he's the author of Asia-Pacific Alliances in the 21st Century. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Professor Huang. Thank you.
All right. It's an honor to be here, and as the former defense ministers, the deputy ministers, I'm really working hard to prepare for our increased response against the increasing North Korean threat provocation. So I'll probably start with how we are dealing with the increasing North Korean threat. So as you know, after a series of provocation made in 2010, we review everything from the scratch. So the proactive deterrence was taken as a new doctrine, and South Korea made very clear that we have to retaliate. If the provocation is made again, we have to the strike against the origin of the provocation and the supporting forces, and even including the commanding post that gave the orders to provoke the South Korea. So that kind of the principle has been maintained, and then even after Park-geun-hye government to take place, this kind of the doctrine has been maintained and further developed. So our concern is how we can avoid the escalation then, and then we should not fall into the kind of the commitment trap. So when you're dealing with such the very the enemy like the state like North Korea, you have to make it very sure that we got to react very promptly and then very strongly. So that's the only way we can prevent further provocation. But at the same time, how we can de-escalate the crisis, that's the very important challenge. It can be done alone, by Korean government itself. So that's why we have to work together with the strategic partners like the United States and the China, Japan, and other regional powers too. So that is our the goal as well as dilemma to deal with this situation. So I try to argue that for example, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. These are areas where the Seoul, the Washington, and Tokyo, and Beijing, and other capitals can help each other. So this is a very important area. So I think in order to avoid that kind of the provocation turn into some the spiral of the dangerous escalation, we have to work together. But unfortunately, we are very much concerned about kind of the surging political nationalism heated by domestic politics. So we should utilize this opportunity better. So I think the opportunity is open for the countries surrounding Korean Peninsula. So my argument is that we have to work together and then to protect the national interest and then the safety of the region from the politics. Thank you. I must stop here.
Thank you very much. Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head with the difficulty there. At the same time, having to react strongly while also wanting to de-escalate the situation. And I think as we get further along in the discussion, we can talk more about regional architecture and how that can be involved. Well, let's turn to our next panelist, Dr. Huang Kwei-Bo. Dr. Huang is the director of the International Master's Program in International Studies and an associate professor in the Department of Diplomacy at National Chengchi University. Between 2009 and 2011, he was chairman of the Research and Planning Committee at Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And among his publications is In Pursuit of Gradual Stabilization and Peace Dividends, Cross-Taiwan Strait Relations, and Their Influence on the Asia-Pacific. So here's another potential area of conflict or flashpoint. Dr. Huang.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Also, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to Seoul, this great city. But unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about the cross-Taiwan Strait issues because now I don't think it is one of the major destabilizing forces in the Asia-Pacific. Rather, I would like to look at many different levels, including state, sub-state, and super-state levels, to figure out the major resources of instability in East Asia. Of course, I think we have talked about strategic conflicts and sovereign conflicts among different state actors in the region, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that because we have mentioned that all the time, starting from day one. The rest three major resources of instability I would like to emphasize include the subjective understanding of East Asian history and problems with good governance and low politics security. And the third and last one is a serious lack of institutionalization of conflict management or prevention in East Asia. These are three other major resources of instability I have in mind. Let me go through them one by one quickly. Subjective understanding of East Asian history. Actually, I don't want to name names, but I think you know which countries I'm referring to. So some countries in the region try to distort or misinterpret the agreed upon history in East Asia. So there have been so many continued disputes between or among these disputants. I have to say that this kind of subjective understanding or interpretation of history would be harmful for the development of East Asian stability and prosperity. So I think with that continuing to be present in East Asia, I think that would cause endless disputes in the region. And problems with good governance and low politics threats. Again, as Anthony mentioned, rapid economic growth and actually associated with a great deal of foreign direct investments in the region have changed the landscape of the region. So there has been a lot of social changes in East Asia. Good governance has therefore become very important, not only for states, but for regional organizations to improve the living conditions of the people in East Asia. Some people try to link good governance to democracy, but here I don't want to do that because I personally do not think democracy is a sufficient and it's a mature condition for the achievement of good governance, because some scholars have argued that you may not need democracy, but you can achieve good governance. That's debatable. What I would like to mention is that maybe climate change, natural disaster management, pandemics like SARS in 2003, and now H7N9 this year taking place in mainland China, and international terrorism, and energy and resources problems. All these things could lead to further destabilization in East Asia. Let me just pick one, energy and resources. Water. Water has become one of the potential problems for future conflict in many, many regions of the world. Some water-rich countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, are also facing some water quality constraints and insufficiency in their major cities. Not to mention in some other countries like Taiwan or some countries without long and big rivers or light water for people's daily life. So I think without better management or control over these potential problems, states and regional institutions would be facing the big problems in the near future. The last one, lack of institutionalization of conflict management or conflict prevention. Some people would ask, see, we have had ASEAN, we have had ASEAN Regional Forum, and we have had several US bilateral 2+2 meetings. And between US and mainland China, we have had SNED. We have so many of them. But to me, I think most of these mechanisms are probably very verbal. More specifically, we have many, many words, but we need more deeds. We need more deeds. So I think the three possibilities that we need to take better care, good care, so that in the near future we can get rid of the potential emerging conflicts among East Asian countries. And I would like to proffer two possible remedies for your considerations. Of course, the two remedies would be very slow. They are not so efficiently effective, but I think that's worth trying. The first one is that maybe we need a stronger and deeper civic mutual understanding of the importance of conflict reduction and regional cooperation. That is, we need to enhance people-to-people exchanges. Of course, we have seen many, many tourists traveling in the region of East Asia. We also see students going to Korea, Japan, mainland China, and Taiwan, and other countries for advanced studies. And migration workers, of course. But these are just, superficial. We need some organized, well-planned activities so that we can better enhance people-to-people mutual understanding, so that they know they can play a constructive role in maintaining or promoting regional peace and stability. Not to mention, this is the era when the domestic civil society could play a bigger role in their domestic decision-making and social media. So in many, many countries that has been democratized or that are democratizing in East Asia, I do believe that these people and the force of civil societies can contribute to some sort of changes in the relocation of the authority from the states, from the state governments. So if I may borrow Professor James Rosenau, my own teacher's words, the relocation of authority will be transformed outwards to transnational and supranational organizations, sidewards to social movements and NGOs, and inwards to subnational groups. So people power. People gradually will influence their own governments so that the governments will not take some assertive or risky policy options. But I still have to mention that states are still very important. I'm not saying states are not important at all. But states and civil society, I think there will be some coordinating mechanism between the two. One last thing, the second remedy is to create and maintain issue-specific regional regimes aimed at the sources of regional instability instead of a holistic approach to managing the whole regional issues. And also, I would like to say that it would be very unrealistic to rely solely on the United Nations or the United States to be the major stabilizing forces in East Asia. We need some coordination among big players in the region. But to be more specific in a slow way, I think we need some issue-specific regional regimes, not some bigger one, wider one. And two possible ways to achieve it. One is that we need to consider the possibility of participation of all directly related actors, all directly relevant actors. Even North Korea, I think some scholars yesterday has mentioned this kind of idea. And Timor-Leste, or even Taiwan, in a meaningful way. Somehow, these actors must join the process so that the stabilization of East Asia can be truly achieved. And last, whether or not maybe a sub-regional regime would be more ideal, so that these actors that haven't been able to join most of the process can have a role in this sub-regional. And these may be less sensitive politically for some major powers. These are just some of my wild thinkings, but hopefully that can trigger more discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huang. I really particularly appreciate your point about the importance of the people-to-people exchange, because I think that's often overlooked. But the ability to simply have a strong group of people who know what the other side is thinking, and particularly in the mill-to-mill aspect of that, having officers who have experience with officers on the other side can make a big difference in de-escalating conflicts as they come up. Let's turn now to Dr. Ren Xiao. Dr. Ren is currently a professor of international politics at Fudan University, and he's the director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Foreign Policy. He's held research or teaching positions at the University of Turku, Nagoya University, and George Washington University. And he's the author of New Frontiers of China's Foreign Relations, along with Alan Carlson. Dr. Ren?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. When I look at the East Asian region, I actually see a number of positive developments. In addition to the chair mentioned at the very beginning, I can add a couple more things. For example, China, Japan, Korea, South Korea negotiations, FTA negotiations got started last month, clearly aiming to the formation of a free trade area among them. Another thing is that the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which involves 13 East Asian countries plus Australia, New Zealand, and India, will get started next month, meaning that the region is becoming increasingly interdependent and integrated. The region across the Taiwan Strait has been not only peaceful and stable over the last 5-6 years, but also that a series of progresses have been made in terms of a more constructive cross-Taiwan Strait relations. In the meantime, the standoff between China and Japan on Diaoyu Islands is continuing. The Korean Peninsula has not been very quiet recently, and there are other disputes, as you know very well. Overall, I'm not pessimistic about the region, and perhaps we can use the word complex to characterize East Asia. Let me use the rest of my time to briefly mention 3 things which I see as sources of difficulty. Number 1 is the burden of history. I do think, well, excuse me, I have to mention Japan here. I do believe that Japan has been peaceful and is peaceful. Japan has achieved so much over the last 60 years. In the meantime, I was disappointed about the unsuccessfulness on the part of Japan to understand the feelings and wishes of the peoples of these neighboring countries. Japan has not very successful in terms of winning the hearts and minds of the neighboring countries. And so the burden of history is quite heavy. So it is a serious question for the East Asian countries. What kinds of efforts they should make for not just, no, I don't like the word apology, because apology is a one-way street, but reconciliation, which is a two-way street, to better achieve a reconciliation between the East Asian countries. Second thing is nationalism, which is not a good thing to me, and it exists in all the East Asian countries, and we need antidote to dissipate the unhealthy sentiments among the East Asian countries. Third thing, at the personal level, I think political figures have to bear special responsibility, which I want to underscore is that the irresponsible acts by politicians would make things worse to cause the involvement of societies and so on. And let me conclude by mentioning 3 things which I think we should do to reduce tensions. Number 1 is avoid miscalculation. For example, I was surprised to hear one Japanese friend who feared that China would somehow use military means to take over the Diaoyu Islands. And I was not very successful to persuade her that would not happen. But she just has this fear. And I said to her, don't misread and don't misunderstand the developments and things that have been happening in the region. Second, the concerned parties have to sit down and discuss what they should do to avoid military conflict. It is not time we do not have mature conditions to solve the sovereignty issue. But for the time being, it is very important for us to discuss how to avoid military conflict, to keep the situation under control. Lastly, I believe media has a special role to play. Very often, they tend to be sensational. They tend to be exaggerating things, which triggers unhealthy sentiments toward each other. So those are the things I would like to mention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reda. I think later on, I think we should return to your point about hearts and minds, because I don't think anyone in the region has been particularly successful at winning hearts and minds in other countries. It's not just Japan, but I think that is an interesting point. But for now, we'll move on to our next presenter, which is Lieutenant General Yamaguchi Noboru. General Yamaguchi is currently a professor and director at the National Defense Academy of Japan. He held responsibilities as commanding general of the GSDF Research and Development Command until he retired from active duty in December 2008. And he's also served in the Prime Minister's office as special advisor to the Cabinet for Crisis Management. General Yamaguchi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. My thanks to Asan Institute, and I enjoy this opportunity very much. And perhaps I need to cooperate with Professor Ren to convince your friends and my friends not to believe that Chinese are using military force to take over the Diaoyu Island. We need to work together. And today, let me focus on rather dry aspects of instability. Just taking a look at capabilities of military capabilities here. In other words, the significant trends in arms build-up in this region. And there are a couple of characteristics different from other regions, arms build-up, particularly in comparison with Europe during the Cold War. If you look at Southeast Asia in the last 2 to 3 decades, particularly nations surrounding South China Sea have been working really hard to build up their naval capabilities. But it is not too much because their capabilities used to be well below the necessity for securing their coastal areas. So their efforts should be welcomed by others because their efforts may bring the more security in that region. So that is one. Another point in this region is if you look at Northeast Asia, it is one of the most militarized areas in the world. On this peninsula, 1 million North Korean troops are in arms, and 600,000 South Korean friends are in arms around DMZ. This is quite a highly dense military population. If you look at the Taiwan Strait too, if you divide the Taiwan's active duty personnel by landmass, every 1 kilometer square, there are 7 to 8 Taiwanese soldiers, which is almost similar to North Korean density, North Korean armed forces density. This is really high, and it might have caused a lot of cost on the lives of Taiwanese, Chinese, and the North Koreans, South Koreans. And that is another point. And another point is very interesting. China and Japan are major powers in the world. Even after the end of Cold War, those two countries have increased the defense military expenditures. Now, my colleagues in Tokyo have been arguing that China is spending too much, saying that China's military spending is 18 times larger than that of 20 years ago. But it's not. Japan is not. Japan is not an exemption. If you look at the IISS military balance of 1992 version, you may see the chart showing the military spendings of major countries, US, European countries, Japan. And every country except for Japan made a sharp drop after 1987, 1988 because of the demise of the Cold War. Only Japan kept increasing defense budget up until the collapse of the bubble economy. So Anthony is right. Because of rapid growth of economy in this region, made the military spendings much more than we used to spend. China's case as well. So those 3 points lead me couple of thoughts. And one is, if you look at Southeast China Sea, the problem is not the excessive military powers, but rather lack of naval capabilities of regional countries. So rather than looking for a kind of arms control, reducing excessive arms to some extent, rather than that, we may have to look at the different kind of arms control, which is harmonized or coordinated build-up for regional security. That is one. And another point is we need to avoid kind of security dilemma. China is spending more and more because China's GDP is just growing. And China's military spending is not too big in terms of percentage out of GDP. But from the neighbors' perspective, particularly Southeast Asian countries, smaller countries, that may be huge. So we may have to avoid kind of insecurity caused by security dilemma. That requires us kind of more and more deeper consultation among regional militaries in the coming decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Yamaguchi, and thank you for making the point that the regional defense spending is cyclical, and in a way it's natural to have an upswing in spending right now. I think the concern for stability is not the defense spending, but the changing capabilities, which make it possible for North Korea with missiles to menace Japan in a way it couldn't before, or Vietnam with a submarine to engage in quite different ways. I want to throw out a question for the panel, jumping off something that Dr. Huang said about the amount of regional architecture that we have in East Asia, and the degree to which it is helpful and the degree to which it is not helpful. For better or for worse, ASEAN has become kind of the convener of the key pieces of political and security regional architecture with the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit. Of course, ASEAN is limited by its own policy of non-interference and its members' internal affairs. People often want to make the comparison that Myanmar could be an example for North Korea as a path forward, but of course Myanmar was involved in ASEAN and in regional organizations since 1997. So Professor Huang, I want to ask you, is there greater opportunity to involve North Korea in regional architecture? Is the current regional architecture something that could be drawn into, or do we need to create new structures?
As you are well aware, that we strongly hope that North Korea should involve in the regional the countries or states for helping the situation better. But the problem is that they only want to talk to the United States as a sole the negotiator at the the negotiation table, which is only dealing with as a nuclear power state. They only want others to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state power. So this is absurd, and then, we can't do that. So this is the problem. So as you just mentioned, we have lots of the institutions dealing with some security, but all they want is the nuclear issue. So that really make us very difficult to suggest that, them to join the others. So we keep, but at the same time, we should not give up our efforts to convince them to look around the way, because as you just mentioned, Myanmar is the way, and Vietnam is the country. They never had the chance to develop their nuclear option, but still they can join the others, and then to after Doi Moi policy, it's now very affluent country, right? So the North Korea should find the example, but the problem is they are now the young leader Kim Jong-un is only focusing on nuclear option. So that's the big challenge for us.
Sure. One of the positives and negatives about ASEAN is it has a million meetings about a million things. And I think, is there a possibility then to try to draw North Korea into some purely unrelated meetings, focused on building people to people or agricultural concerns or other things like that? Dr. Huang, did you want to raise something?
Yeah, it just reminds me of some past examples of ASEAN inviting mainland China to ASEAN summit in the 1990s. So if my memory serves me correctly, mainland China attended ASEAN summit in the capacity of chairman's friend invited by chairman of ASEAN summit. So I think that could be one of the very possible way, to draw North Korea into some sort of regional socialization mechanisms without triggering more political, worries of, either South Korean, Japan, or North Koreans.
Makes sense. Dr. Ren.
I'm not optimistic about that because DPRK has been a member of at least more than one regional groupings, AIF, ASEAN Regional Forum, for example. But it has been on and off for a long time. And recently they withdrew from the Greater Truman Initiative, an initiative to try to develop Northeast Asian region. And they utilized this as their tactics to achieve what they wanted. That's my observation. So it has been difficult to use regional architecture or groupings.
But I have two thoughts. That is, being willing to be utilized by North Koreans, because our major goal is to draw them into our game. So the past failures, including ARF or some others, would be mostly politically or military oriented. So if, just a big if, we can, not we, ASEAN, for example, can invite North Korea to join some of the non-political, non-military, meetings, so that North Korea can at least see the world, engage the world, and maybe we are going to have a very small step. Then we can be followed by bigger steps.
Yes, General.
ASEAN has a wonderful record on their efforts to deal with piracy. It used to be in the 1990s, the South China Sea is the most frequent piracy area, and some 40 to 50% of all the pirates incident were happening there. But now it's no less than 10% because of the cooperation between regional countries as well as outside countries. Chinese law enforcement has been working really hard, and Japanese has been helping regional countries to provide them with surveillance capabilities. That can be applied for the future better areas, and that may even extend it to North Korean benefit.
And the positive thing about that is it involves both political to political and mill to mill contacts, and builds some familiarity on a couple of key issues. Well, as we know, next year Myanmar is the ASEAN chair, and they've taken some heat for their relationship with North Korea. So maybe we'll have to wait until Malaysia comes in 2015 to suggest someone invite them as a special friend. Why don't we open this up to the floor? Walter, over here.
It seems like to me we're overlooking a major source of instability. The problem of subjective understanding of history is not just a Japanese issue. One of the things that's driving instability now is the Chinese narrative about its own history, its sense of grievance, the way that it weaves in the various territorial disputes in the region. All of the facts surrounding the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Senkakus are all disputed. It's not as if Japan is the only one that has a history or an interpretation of that history. China has its own history, and at least in the South China Sea, it's creating a lot of instability. That is how it paints this particular history. I wonder if you all can address that.
Thank you, Walter. And I think that's a key point that all of these problems are sort of bound up in other problems.
If I may jump ahead
Yes.
for just a quick response. So I use pluralism to refer to countries with subjective interpretation of East Asian history. So actually I'm referring to more than 2 countries with some misunderstanding about our history.
Sure. Yeah. Dr. Ren, you want to say something?
Yeah, a short answer to the question is I agree. And in recent years, Japan and China, they formed a joint committee on history textbooks, and they did some work and produced at least 1 volume to co-write a history textbook for use in both countries. Unfortunately, that effort has been affected by the crisis broke out last year. So there's no progress recently. This is one way that our 2 countries, Japan and China, can work together. And I think there are other ways and can involve other countries, for example, Korea, to make efforts. So I think basically you're right.
General.
Yeah, I tend to see the difference between European nation states and Asian nation states. And the Asian countries are relatively new in terms of dealing with other countries, particularly for border issue or territorial disputes, while the European countries are so accustomed to dealing with those issues in the last hundreds of years. So the Asian countries are not accustomed to those disputes. Within such countries, China is one of the most experienced. China has been working really hard with Russians, Indians, and other countries. So we are now at the kind of at the learning curve, and Japan is no exception, and we are really new to deal to those territorial disputes. So sovereign issue is really new and hard to make compromises.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult as an international community to address individual countries' interpretation or understanding of events as they happened. But what we can do at least is figure out what are the facts on the ground and what can we separate from that kind of morass of what happened to say these are at least the things that we all can agree are happening right now and that we have no particular choice but to deal with. Yeah. Other questions from the floor? Well, why don't we return to the idea of winning hearts and minds? We've seen some efforts from China in particular over time to roll out what was called the Charm Offensive in Southeast Asia, and that's rolled back a little bit. Dr. Ren, can you talk a little bit about how that has been successful or not successful, and what maybe China needs to do in the future to address that?
All right. Let's use the example of China and ASEAN. In 1991, they agreed to form a strategic partnership, and since then, China and ASEAN have been have successfully created a China ASEAN FTA, and by and large, they've both benefited from this formation of a free trade area. Politically, they solved first bilaterally, established all the bilateral relationships, diplomatic relationships. The final two ones were Indonesia and Singapore. And based on that, China and ASEAN as a group have developed their relationship quite well. Politically, they agreed to set aside their disagreement, their differences, and they came up with a DOC, Declaration of Conduct in South China Sea. But how successful the DOC has been is an open question. And what are the other things? In recent years, it has appeared that there have been a series of disputes, the emergence of disputes. And I think, well, the disputes have been there for many years. For example, China and Japan. It is not possible for them to be solved anytime soon. So the issue, I think, is that what we should do to manage them and to manage the disputes well. I think that is the question. So overall, I think we have seen quite a few positive developments.
Yes, Dr. Wang.
If I would can add, Nicole, University of Southern California, has identified 5 major approaches to public diplomacy, trying to win in hearts and minds of the people. And so I think what East Asian countries in general is lacking is the ability to listen, the very first technique, very first approach identified by Nicholas Cole. So I think all the governments in East Asia not only need to carry out a lot of constructive programs like aid or educational programs, exchange programs, but to listen to your counterparts' needs and feelings, so that these countries can win people's hearts and minds.
Thank you. That's a great point. We had a question in the second row and then the front row over here.
Dominic Ziegler from The Economist. I'd love to ask the panelists whether the emergence of China's articulation of core interests, most recently towards the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands, adds to stability in the region or detracts from it.
That's a great question.
Great question.
I don't know. It will, what kind of effect it will have on Diaoyu dispute? But I think it was an emphasis that telling the visiting guests, General Dempsey, for example, telling them that this is a very important issue for us. And the concerned parties have to be careful. Let us be careful in terms of handling of the dispute. So I believe that it was a emphasis.
Okay. General Yamaguchi, do you want to add something?
My answer is the same. I don't know, but I felt like China is big, and China's core is bigger than Japanese.
Farah?
Thanks very much. Chris Nelson and I had the honor of chairing the history discussion this morning, and Professor Ren, I wish he'd been on my panel, is all I can say. To follow up on some of the themes raised, and also to follow up on the question of the distinguished gentleman from the FT, the notion of trying to find ways to let, if not regional architecture, regional players help each other diffuse some of these specific bilateral debates, I find both intriguing and potentially positive, because for all the reasons we've been discussing, particularly when it's a nationalist-based problem or a potential resource-based territorial sovereignty dispute, when it's just bilateral, it seems almost impossible to think of ways to get out of it, because it always seems to be something of a zero-sum game for one side or the other side. Is it possible to think creatively about regional approaches to diffusing, for example, some of the history disputes, to find ways to have, for example, the comfort women tragedy, which tends to be portrayed mostly as a Japan-Korea issue, when in fact, of course, it was a pan-Asia issue. All the women of Asia were involved in one way or another in this tragedy. And as Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, tried to emphasize towards the end of last year, the link of the comfort women tragedy is to the modern international movement and awareness of violence against women. It's a problem right now, today. It isn't just something that was 60 years or 80 years ago. So I'm asking, do you think we might be able to be more creative in how we try to help each other overcome these horribly bitter nationalist personal disputes by, in a sense, broadening them to the community? We all have a community interest in peace and stability and getting along. Maybe we should try to bring some of these terribly painful bilateral issues to a broader community-based approach. Thank you.
Professor Huang, do you want to reply to that?
Well, not exactly that issue, but when you mentioned that how we're gonna win the hearts and minds of the people, this might be a good example for Korea. In 2007, when the China has some huge earthquake took place in Sichuan province, the President Lee Myung-bak decided to go down to the Sichuan province himself. So there was at that time lots of worries, and also from the Chinese part also there is some reservation too. But he did it by himself, and then also the Korean Air Force for the first time after Korean armistice, they send the three cargos, C-130, full of the disaster relief goods to send those places, and then try to educate the people the Korean people that even China and South Korea doesn't really have an improved relationship in that area of security cooperation. But that was the good part of the solution. So I think the crisis response initiative is kind of the area where the different countries can help each other for the future.
I agree. I think we've seen a couple areas where HADR cooperation has been extremely effective in building people-to-people ties and just helping resolve terrible situations. Absolutely. General.
In addition to HADR, UNPKO peacekeeping operations provide us with opportunity to cooperate with others. For example, a good example is our first ever peacekeeping operation in Cambodia was done with Chinese colleagues. Chinese engineer battalion deployed north of us, which is more dangerous, so that Japanese self-defense forces enjoyed safer environment, while PLA suffered from two KIAs and dozens of injured. We actually we are helped by PLA, and in East Timor a couple of years ago, thanks to Korean infantry battalion, our engineer battalion was enjoying a safe operational environment. In such cases, our troops are side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and working together for the same purpose. That is one of the places we need to play up.
If I add up a little bit about General Yamaguchi's statement, and the Korea, we are going to send our PKO unit to Sudan, the South Sudan, and then South Sudan is where the Chinese PLA and then Japanese the PKO forces are operating now. So that must be the way the three countries can help each other. So we're very much looking for that chance.
Great. We got a question right over here. Yes, this gentleman.
My name is Young-Sun Park from Korea. I'd like to mention about the role of the political leadership. We have been discussing the new leadership in Korea, Japan, and China will make a difference, and we have a high expectation. But so far, they serve as a source of instability as well as stability in the new environment. I'm just wondering, each of these panelists see that there is a possibility, anyhow, this younger, better educated the leadership will do better job to reconcile and harmonize East Asian affairs in the future.
Does anybody want to respond to that? And it's not just China, Japan, Korea. We've also seen recent changes in the Philippines and Thailand. We have a presidential election coming up in Indonesia, an important one in Malaysia very soon. Dr. Ren?
Perhaps briefly, a brief response to Chris, your question. I was sorry I missed your panel because I was in a different session. On your question of bilateral or multilateral, I think what the government officials often find is that when three sides are involved to discuss something, it would become much more difficult than two sides are talking with each other. When two sides are talking with each other, it's much easier. And when three sides and more sides are involved, it would become very, very difficult for them to find way out. But I think that a track 2 dialogue involving three parties, for example, can be useful because they have dialogues in a more relaxed way to fully exchange views between and among them, and come up with suggestions, recommendations, and those suggestions and recommendations can be accepted by the governments. So that might be a good way to move forward.
Great. If we can return to the leadership question over here, I wonder, Professor Huang, if you might want to address how the changes in leadership have changed the North Korea-South Korea dynamic.
Well, it is still difficult for us to give a kind of momentum, because find a momentum, because the North Korea young leaders still, announce that they try to convince the world that, it can hurt others. And then even I don't know whether he knew what he said, himself, but recently he just made it very clear that he will preemptively use the nuclear weapon against, not only South Korea, Japan, and all the surrounding countries. So this is, unacceptable. So when the leadership use that kind of a strong rhetoric, it's very difficult for others, to teach, some kind of peace education. So there are certain, limitations. But, after I just finished it, the government job, and then returned to campus, the class. In my class, I have a couple of students from Japan and China and Mongols. So I was quite surprised to see, the foreign students are, listening to my lecture. So I try to emphasize that how we can help each other and how we can construct for the future. So that kind of attitude is very much needed, and then we will probably work very hard to teach students to build for the future.
Correct. Dr. Huang.
Speaking on the new leadership issue, it's just my hunch that among Northeast Asian countries, including, our countries here, I think newer leadership might be able to bring up the opportunities of, coming to a more stable relations rather than, very assertive interactions. Take the cross-Taiwan Strait relations, for example. I think when Xi Jinping comes to power and Taiwan's Ma Ying-jeou continues his second term, you can see, even though there hasn't been any salient progress in cross-strait relations, but such relations have maintained stable, which is good in comparison with its past 60 years. Good enough. So gradually, hopefully, we can make some progress in the future. But in Southeast Asia, I think what I would stress is this new leadership's ability for good governance. Again, my previous topic. If you look at World Bank's criterion on good governance, accountability, and political stability, and government effectiveness, etc., and rule of law will be very important for these leaders. So I don't exclude the possibility that if this new leadership in Southeast Asia cannot maintain their good governance ability, then maybe there will be some divergent, effect on their domestic or foreign policies, which will further destabilize the region or the sub-region.
Sure. General?
Yeah. Maybe my view is kind of the view on the neighbor lawn looks greener. And Chinese power tradition looks better than Japanese power tradition and the Koreans as well. And in terms of Japan, I wish if the strong support for Abe makes Abe more relaxed and hopefully becoming a kind of Japanese Nixon in the future.
He was Nixon in 2006 when he made that ice-breaking trip to China and Korea. 2006.
They've just flashed the 5 minutes on me, so we have time for one or two more. If there are other questions from the floor. One issue that I would like to raise that we haven't actually talked about as a source of instability is there are still some long-running insurgencies going on in East Asia, in Thailand in the south, in the Philippines, although that seems to be getting a little bit better, and in Myanmar there's still a number of ethnic conflicts going on. And in particular, I note there was a report that was widely spread in the last day or so about China passing attack helicopters to the Hua. And I wonder if some of the panelists might like to comment a bit on those issues.
I haven't heard of anything about your mentioning, but I do know that we played a role to bring together Myanmar government officials and the rebellions together in really Yunnan for a kind of mediating role, for them bring them together to have dialogues and to find our way out. And that happened twice, I believe, which I think China is slowly changing its this way of thinking in terms of helping one of the neighboring countries to solve their domestic problem, something like that, which may be a healthy, a good thing.
People,
Yes,
having another question, I'll just mention about when you mentions about touch upon the disparities. So when we look at the disparities between the North Korea and the countries, we better look at the disparities even growing within North Korean regime. That is a very important factor. Even if you look at the Kim Jong-un and his close the staff members, they're showing up on TV, they are enjoying the Japanese style the cuisine and very luxurious, and then that shouldn't be the reach to their countrymen, the people, ordinary people. But so that's why I think the China, the Japan, Korea, United States, and other regional parties will probably focus on how we can reduce the gap between the ordinary North Korean people and those handful, the powerful the clique within Pyongyang. So we'll probably more creative to to create establish kind of the informal regimes, or use the institution we have. So but what is very important is we have to give them kind of a hope for the future. So absolutely, we are not forgetting them. So that is very important, the message we should give.
Absolutely, been a source of instability in a number of countries in the region. It's the primary driver of the conflicts in Thailand, and it's going to be a serious challenge for Myanmar over the next couple of years. We've been told that we need to wrap up, but I want to give my panelists a chance if they would like to make a very brief final statement. General?
Yeah, just one point. We may have to look for the kind of code of conduct on the maritime theater. Maybe the other panel will be maybe discussing, but this is really important because our navies are growing and the interaction getting more and more frequent. And then we have to have a rule, common rule to follow.
Great. Dr. Ren?
No, I don't.
No, great.
So very quick, on the East China Sea issue, Taiwan has launched the East China Sea Peace Initiative, calling for 3 sets of bilateral cooperation coordination among Taiwan, Japan, mainland China, then ultimately leading to a trilateral cooperation and coordination, which is very hard to achieve, but I think it's good to know that.
Great. Professor Huang?
To prevent further provocation from North Korea, we got to help, need to coordinate with Japan and China and others. So you definitely need, the intelligence cooperation with Japan. But the problem is, these political, national sentiment, from the domestic politics. We can't, proceed anymore. So that should be, considered. And then also the China. We are very much looking for China's larger role in influencing North Korea.
Great.
I'll stop here.
Well, we didn't solve all the problems, but we had some good ideas. So thank you very much to the panelists, and thanks to the Asan Institute. Enjoy your coffee.